All right, so today we're going to talk a little bit about stress, anxiety, and some other neurodevelopmental disorders. You guys talked about some stuff last week with schizophrenia and other neurological disorders, right? So that was kind of fun. These are the really uplifting chapters, right? Like, hey, you guys might get Huntington's disease. That's going to be fun. Let's talk about brain tumors. No, nobody gets thrilled about that. So let's talk about stress and some of these other sort of disorders that are lumped into this chapter. I'm just going to hit the high notes. What is stress? None of you have ever experienced that, right? I mean, that's definitely something I assume you know nothing about, so we'll start at the very bottom. Just kidding. I think most of you know. For our purposes, we're interested in that physiological reaction to stress, right? Doesn't really matter what the stress is, but it's your reaction that's going to be important. We're going to think about the fight or flight response, and there's kind of that third freeze, right? So fight, flight, or freeze. Now, typically, getting stressed is good, right? For some things, right? How many of you have been, I don't know, Adriana, you've probably had to run some distance, right? And getting stressed is good for that, right? So you want to have some stress in the beginning because you're going to liberate these nutrients. You're going to change your blood flow, right? So you're like sending more blood to your legs than maybe like your stomach, right? Because you don't really need to like digest anything while you're running. And so those stress hormones help for that. They'll increase your heart rate. They'll increase your blood pressure. They allow you to do some pretty amazing things, right? And that's awesome if you're running a race and there's like some end point, right? And you're like done. You're like, okay, I can relax. I'm going to go home and, you know, I don't know, watch The Natural, right? So that's what your plan is. Cindy, the whole point of that story about The Natural was there's a great pep talk in there where the guy talks about losing and how it's like a venereal disease, and there's just like this team and they're losing badly. Here's the spoiler alert: when they put in Robert Redford, they start winning because he's a phenomenal baseball player. Which, by the way, if you've read the book The Natural, the movie's nothing like it, so whatever. Anyway, you've got stress. Now, if you have this long-term continuous stress, then that's going to be a real problem, right? We'll talk about that. Those glucocorticoids are going to cause some serious problems. Particularly, we want to think about cardiovascular issues, right? High blood pressure is not cool. Okay, it's going to cause some serious long-term problems. You can have heart disease. Stress causes a whole host of other problems. We'll talk about those as we go. Basically, we're going to get our sympathetic branch of that autonomic nervous system keyed up, right? It's going to get your adrenal glands going, so think about that adrenaline rush, right? That's why we call it the adrenaline rush. So we're going to shoot out a bunch of epinephrine, norepinephrine. Primarily, we're going to think about things like cortisol as our stress hormone there, and that's going to really do some awesome things. It's going to change your glucose metabolism. It's going to increase blood flow to muscles, which is awesome. Again, if you're in that short-term situation, you need to perform some actions to either get out of that situation or into that situation, and then you can go back to your normal sort of operating procedures, right? And that's pretty cool. If you're in that constant state of stress, and we'll talk about folks who are in that constant state of stress when we talk about post-traumatic stress disorder, when we talk about anxiety disorders, panic disorders, right? Those things will definitely cause you some problems. We'll talk about folks who are in stressful situations. If they have a spouse that has Alzheimer's and they're a caregiver for their spouse, that's going to be a stressful situation. And we'll talk about some of the effects of stress for that long term. Stress really works by getting something called the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis started, right? Like most hormones, there are sort of three hormones that are involved here, right? And so, Caroline, the first thing we need to do is we need to get the hypothalamus to say, okay, this is a stressful situation. I'm going to release a hormone. That hormone floats over to the pituitary gland, and the pituitary gland says, oh, I received this hormone, then I need to send another hormone, right, somewhere else to release the actual hormone that's going to make a difference to our bodies, right? And then that third hormone is that glucocorticoid. That's the guy that is going to actually cause the effects, right? It's actually going to cause your heart rate to increase, blood pressure to increase, change that glucose metabolism. But it's that three-step process. this is why when you have been in a stressful situation and that situation ends, you still feel the effects of that for a little bit of time, right? Until these hormones kind of wash out. It's a longer process than just your, synaptic firing, right? When your synapses are firing and you're like, oh, the stimulus is gone, then that effect ends. Hormones, they last longer. They take a little bit longer to start up, but they can still start pretty quickly. And then they last just little bit longer. It's this extended process. It's also widespread. This is another reason it's important to control this through hormones. If we were just doing it with neurotransmitters, that's a very localized effect, right? We really want a full body response to a stressful situation. And so using a hormone for that makes a lot of sense. Don't worry too much about this CRH. That's one of those hormones, and if you inject that, you'll actually get the same response. Again, it's important to know that the short-term effects of glucocorticoids, and those are your stress hormones, are essential for existence, right? If you can imagine someone who never gets stressed, right? What happens to that person? Well, they probably die, right? Just think about, you're walking around town, and you're just like, well, that's a dark alley with somebody asking me to come down to the end of it and see what's going on. I think I will. I'm not going to get stressed out about that, right? That person just walks right in there. And guess who doesn't walk right out? That person, right? That's how you lose a kidney. Write that down because you want to keep your kidneys in case you need them later. If you have some sort of fear response, that's great. You get that stress. Awesome, but we don't want those long-term effects. Here's a diagram of the circuit. This is your hypothalamus. Remember, it's going to release corticotropin-releasing hormone. That's going to activate your anterior pituitary gland, cause it to release adrenocorticotropic hormone. Right now, it's a mouthful, but it's got the adrenal part there, so we know it's going to affect the adrenal cortex. When this guy receives ACTH, it will dump out typically cortisol. Jacob's the guy we're thinking about there. He's kind of the big glucocorticoid, the big stress hormone. You guys have probably heard about cortisol levels before, right? If you read a lot of literature, you'll see that they measure cortisol levels to kind of measure stress, right? One of the reasons they do that is you can measure cortisol in saliva. So it's an easy sort of way to kind of objectively measure your stress level, right? How much cortisol do you have circulating in your body? So there you go. I know there's been some folks in our department who've done studies looking at cortisol levels. If you have to give, you have to get up in front of a group and give a speech or something, so they'll make you get up and talk, and then they'll make you spit in a cup. Sounds brilliant. They'll measure the cortisol level. I know, right? Why did you make that face? Reminds me, like last year at Christmas, my brother got me one of those DNA testing kits. So he got one for him too, right? And so it's like our Christmas party, the family Christmas party, and my brother and I are over in the corner with these little vials, like trying to spit in there and not create bubbles. The whole time, and my mom's like, is it time for turkey? I don't know what's going on here. So, sort of interesting. I don't know. Anybody ever done one of those? Yeah, they're kind of interesting, right, Sydney? I mean,
it's almost 85% British. I don't even know how you did that.
I mean, yeah. Way to go. I don't know. Then you always get those weird ones too, right? Like once in a while you're like looking at it there like, whatever. Yeah, no, they're kind of fascinating, right? So you can have those breakdowns. My brother and I were doing some genealogical research, and we thought that might be helpful. Yeah, I'm not one of those. Yeah. but if you guys are,
don't do it.
yeah, I know. Like some of you are regretting that now. You're like, well, there you go. I don't know. I thought it was kind of cool. All right, anything else you need to know there? I don't think so. This is kind of fascinating. Stress and hypertension, right? So they looked at two groups of air traffic controllers. They pick someone from a high-stress airport. I think when I think high-stress airports, I think about the one in Canova. Really high stress. I don't know if any of you guys have ever flown in or out of there. Adriana, have you done that? Yeah. There's like one person, I think there are two people who work there. Because I know there's someone who flies the plane, and I've seen someone spin the propeller to get it started. So there are at least two people who work at that airport. But I think the same person like checks you at security and like loads your bag and like sells you things from the, it's like a cart, right? There's like an indoor hot dog stand where they will sell you food. And then you walk out one of the three gates, which really is just one of the three doors that goes out to where they park the airplane. And then there it is. So that's a low stress airport. A high stress airport might be something like Chicago O'Hare, right? So that's pretty stressful if you guys have ever flown in or out of Chicago. LaGuardia, you know, that's a big one. I don't know. Charlotte.
Pittsburgh to Atlanta.
Oh, Atlanta. That's awful. See, what helps if, like, Charlotte's a big hub too, but they have rocking chairs once you get in there, which is kind of nice. I don't know if you've ever flown in or out of Charlotte, but they have rocking chairs for you. There are very few airports that have rocking chairs, right?
Food's actually kind of good there. I got stuck there for like 3 hours.
In Charlotte?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's not bad.
Really good Mexican place. It wasn't the worst place to be stuck.
For an airport, it's not so bad. And they usually have Guinness on draft if you walk around a little bit. So that'll help you get through, like waiting for your plane. So, there you go. So high stress, low stress. Guess what? We're all probably going to get hypertension at some point in our lives, right? So I'm holding out for that. That probably means you've just lived long enough, right, to develop that. So hang in there. It's a milestone. What I think is really fascinating when you look at this graph, the folks who work in that high stress environment, I mean, they're like in their mid 30s there, and then the next thing you know is like, okay, so everything's pretty well on pace, and then look at that big gap, right? The folks who work at that high stress really about 10 years early start developing hypertension compared to folks who work at the low stress airport, right? And that can really cause long-term problems to your kidneys. You start blowing bigger holes in your kidneys, so your proteins start falling out, which is bad because then you start to develop like acidosis, right? And you sort of like eat yourself from the inside out, which is bad because your blood pH has got to be in that narrow range. You start throwing out all your albumin. It's not a lot of fun. So there you go. Low stress. This is also like, stay off the salty foods, right? Yeah. I know how much you guys love McDonald's. I don't know if that's true. Do you ever, so like once every like so many years, I think like I'm gonna go eat at McDonald's, right? Because I'm like, wow, I remember how great those French fries were. And then you eat them and you're just like sick. Like, that's gonna do me for another 5. It's like, I'm not gonna need to go back there. Does anybody else have that experience? Yeah. And you have that, like, I don't know. I do that with gummy bears too. I think like, oh man, I want some gummy bears. And then I'm like, oh geez, I feel sick now. I guess I shouldn't eat them by the bag. I mean, like, like the 5-pound bag. All right, long-term stress. Really, things you got to worry about, again, high blood pressure, damage to your muscles, you can develop diabetes, infertility, inhibition of growth. I don't think that one's an important one for you guys. Most of you, I know this is going to be a real, buzzkill. You're done growing, so don't anticipate getting any taller. I don't know if you're kind of happy with your height. Anybody ever think when they were kids, like, oh, I want to wake up tomorrow and be like, 5 feet taller? It's like, oh, that's going to be awesome. Now as an adult, I think, that's all new pants. It's like, I don't want to get taller because I've got a bunch of pants that fit me at this height. So it's like, I think just for my budget, staying the same height makes a lot of sense right now. The other thing is you have to worry about inhibition of inflammatory responses and suppression of the immune system. Now, typically we think about reducing inflammation being a good thing, but that's chronic inflammation, right? There's a reason you get inflamed. It's because, Rebecca, something's irritating you, and you need to get rid of it, right? That's why you're inflamed, wherever that is. So if you have an infection, you're going to have an inflammatory response. You're going to send more blood cells there, more blood. It's going to cause some swelling, some heat, but you're trying to get rid of an infection. So in the short term, inflammation's awesome, right? That's why fever is cool, right? Fever is just your body responding to an infection. When fever gets out of hand and it lasts too long, that's when you really run into the problem, right? It's a perfectly normal, natural reaction to an infection, right? And so that's how fevers work. So we don't want to necessarily reduce the inflammatory process for the normal situation, right below baseline. We don't want it elevated, but if it's at baseline, then you're fine. It also works against your immune system, which we'll talk about some of the details on that in just a moment. So here's stress and wound healing. This is kind of interesting. This is looking at folks who are caregivers for folks with Alzheimer's disease. And what was noted is there was actually a delay in their wound healing, right? So they were not able to recover as quickly. Let's say they accidentally cut their hands, they had some other kind of puncture wound. It took them longer to heal from that than someone in the control group. The other thing that happens to you is glucocorticoids will kill your brain cells. Specifically, I know, right, Rosie? You just got really surprised by that. It was really specifically cells in the CA1 field of the hippocampus, right? And so we know the hippocampus is important for learning and memory, right? For taking those memories and consolidating them into long-term memories. And this is why I say, don't get worried about forgetting something. Then more brain cells will die because you're stressed, and then you'll forget even more stuff. And it's just a vicious cycle. So try to reduce stress from your life as much as possible, right? That's why you should do positive sort of stress reduction things. This is my self-care lecture, right? You guys diet, exercise, get some rest, watch good movies like The Natural, starring Robert Redford. It's a classic. Even though he's 82, he was not 82 when he made this movie. Although I think he was significantly older than the person he was playing in the movie. Because I think The Natural came out in the early 80s, which would have made him, he still would have been like old. Yeah, it's not that long ago. It's like, I guess it's like 35 years ago, 36 years ago, whenever it came out. Whatever. He was still older. So, anyway, so you got to watch out for that cell death. We'll talk about how that works in a moment. We'll actually talk about it now. It actually decreases glutamate reuptake, so that's bad, and it also decreases glucose that comes into the cells. You need glucose in your neurons because glucose goes over to the mitochondria. The mitochondria use that to make ATP, right? You guys know how that powerhouse of the cell business works, and the Krebs cycle and all that fun stuff. And that's what gives you energy for those cells. If you don't have energy, then those cells die. It's not a big deal. Prenatal stress can definitely cause long-term malfunctions in your learning and memory. So if you think like, oh, I have trouble learning and memory stuff right now, the best thing you can do is go back in time and tell your mom to relax. So I don't know if that's an option for you. If it's not, I'm sorry. If any of you are thinking about having children, I recommend staying relaxed while you do that, right? And plan ahead, like 2 years ahead. Not like 10 minutes, like 2 years ahead, right? Like some people plan 10 minutes ahead before they have a kid. You got to plan 2 years because you got to get your diet, your vitamins, you got to get all that stuff cleared up. If you're on medications, you got to figure out, can I do without these medications? What are the effects going to be on my kids? And it's really a lot of effort. I know you don't think it is because people have been having kids for like millennia, right? I mean, that's just how it works, but you've got to give your kids the best option. You know, like, you don't want them to start behind the gun, right? Because the next thing you know, they're going to be like gene editing babies, right? And those kids are going to have a major advantage over your kids if they're born just right. So you got to prepare for this. So you got to make sure you do everything you can. Make sure your kids are as good as they can be. And then you never know. It's a crapshoot. All right, so here's kind of an interesting study with rats. And what they would do is they would expose these rats to the smell of a cat. Typically, they do this with cat urine, right? That's kind of the best way to... I mean, you know, usually if you smell cat urine, you know a cat's nearby. Sometimes in this town, if you smell cat urine, it means there's meth nearby. So that can be confusing. Still something to get stressed about. For those of you that don't know, methamphetamine does smell like cat urine. So if you ever like go into somebody's house and you smell a bunch of cat urine, Rosie, and you're like, hey, you guys have cats? They're like, no. We also don't have any teeth. Then you probably know they're cooking the meth and you need to get out of there because it could explode. Taylor, that's a true story.
Sounds true.
It sounds true. No, it really is true. Trust me. Trust me, it's true. So here's the basic story to take away from this graph. When the rats were exposed to the cat urine and they were stressed out, they weren't very good at learning a spatial task, right? And we also know the hippocampus is involved. Remember the taxi drivers and the larger hippocampal volume, because they have that nice spatial map of the world, right? So the hippocampus is involved in that as well. Here's another thing that I think is really fascinating. These early life stress reduces the volume of your prefrontal cortex, right? And the prefrontal cortex is important. We've talked about this: impulse control, higher order function. We've talked about like planning, complex problem solving, abstract thought. All of that stuff's going on in your prefrontal cortex. What I think's, not surprising is you guys know about ACEs, adverse childhood experiences, right? The more of those you have, the harder it's going to be for you later. And that's just really the situation, right? If you were malnourished, if you were abused, if you had some major loss in your life early on, those are things that are going to put you at risk for things later. You need to be aware of those so that you can take those steps to mitigate against that as best as you can. But what I think is cool is when you can take these sort of external events and map that onto an actual developmental process, right? When you look at folks and they have more early life stress events and they have a smaller dorsomedial prefrontal cortex, that's pretty interesting, right? Like those things that happen to you, that happen to anybody, actually have a profound effect on your development, right? And your brain development, that neurological effect. I think that's really sort of a fascinating thing, right? Another reason not to have kids unless you're certain you can prevent all of their early life stress.
It also causes you to have more troubles, smoke cessations and other people with lesser ACEs.
Absolutely.
The more you have, the harder it is for you to quit.
Yeah. So there you go. Well, that's interesting. So there you go. Explains so much. It does sometimes, right? You have these kind of like epiphany moments. You're like, whoa. I think in some ways that's, some people think, well, that's like very deterministic. I think it's very liberating at some point, right? And you're like, oh, not that it's not my fault. You're still responsible for your own actions. You should like be an adult and do what you need to do. But on the other hand, I think the better you understand the context in which you find yourself, the better you can maneuver through that, right? And if you're constantly trying something, you're like, why isn't this working? And you're like, oh, well, I had like 5 ACEs when I was a kid. Maybe I should try a different approach that's more effective for individuals who have that kind of background, and then you can have some success, right? Makes a lot of sense to me. That's my take on it, but, the stress thing's not something I worry about too much. Sometimes I worry, sometimes like, do I even have an amygdala? Is that thing even in there? It's just like, what's going on? So, true story. They thought I was deaf when I was a kid. Because, like, if I was like outside in front of a car and somebody honked the horn, I didn't turn around. so they thought that I was deaf. So my parents like took me to like get my ears checked and stuff, and they're like, well, we don't know. And so they like make noises. I'm like, whatever, So my hearing is perfect, and I think it always has been. It's just like my startle response is not there for some reason. They like honk the horn, like, which I get. I don't know why my parents thought this was like a great, neurological test for me. Was like, just put him in front of the car and have your grandpa honk the horn and like see if he gets scared by that. I don't know, but that's a true story, folks. That's a little insight to me. I don't know if that's helpful to anybody. That explains so much, doesn't it? Jeez, whatever. Don't worry about that. We should talk about psychoneuroimmunology. I'm not going to hit you too hard with a lot of these, immunology kind of things. We do kind of want to think about what is an antigen. This is something bad that gets in your body that makes you, well, I shouldn't say bad. This is something that gets in your body that causes you to make antibodies. Antibodies are things that will flag a foreign substance, or think about a virus, a bacteria, things like that, and will flag it for destruction. Okay. When I said an antigen is something bad, an antigen's not always something bad. how many of you have had all of your vaccines? Should have asked that day one, because if you're not raising your hand, you need to leave. So you need to get your vaccines, right? Get vaccinated every chance you get. When they're passing out a free vaccination, take it, right? Even if you already had that one, just go ahead and get it again, because you never know, it might wear off, right? And the last thing we want are a bunch of people spreading diseases like they do in Texas, and they're like, hey, let's give everybody measles, even though we'd solved that measles problem. What we have not given people a vaccine against yet, Jacob, is idiocy. Yeah, as soon as they develop an idiocy vaccine, oh man, so many people are going to get that, and I'm going to sign up. I'm just going to get a dart gun and just run around and tag people all day long. Just shoot them with that vaccine. Indiscriminately. Doesn't matter. You're Starbucks, you're getting 2. There you go. You're watching, Friends instead of The Natural, you're getting 3. Just going to double dose you there. Because it's just a bad story, right? So, yeah, Bill Gates is going to fix that. I'm just holding out. I mean, he basically took care of polio in Africa, so we're hoping he takes care of it here once it's mutated. That's why everybody's like hates Microsoft, Steve Jobs was a fill in the blank, whatever you want to call him. But Bill Gates is like, him and his wife are out there giving money to colleges, solving childhood diseases. It's like, I hate Microsoft. This guy's like really changing the world. Steve Jobs was a real turd. When you're 60? Really? Yeah. As long as you've had chickenpox, you can get shingles. So, good luck. Yeah, you still need to get a shingles vaccine. I don't know. I'm not worried about shingles. Although I'll tell you, my wife's family, not her, but her sister, her mom, and her dad, between the 3 of them, they've had shingles 5 times. Which means somebody had it twice, right? So that's not a lot of fun. Yeah. They have a what? Oh. Sign up for that one if you're worried about it. Shingles is not fun. It's fun when it happens to somebody else, because you can just kind of like, haha, you're in a lot of pain. I'm not. Yeah, but you don't want shingles. Yeah. They'll tell you if you need shingles. You're really worried about this, right?
My supervisor got shingles in her eyes.
Yeah, that's bad. Yeah, it's pretty serious. Sometimes it's only like half of your body gets shingles, which is kind of weird. Yeah, that's it, right? Sometimes it's just like one limb. Sometimes people just get it like half of their upper body will have shingles and the other half's fine. It's just kind of a weird situation. Yeah. So there you go. You're worried about shingles. That's great. Taking care of yourself. So anyway, antigens, antibodies. So the antigens are sometimes not bad. Sometimes they're good. When you take a vaccine, that's an antigen because that causes you to produce antibodies, right? So when you get the flu vaccine, we're giving you something that will trick your immune system into making antibodies against that strain of the flu. That way when that strain of the flu gets in you, those antibodies are already there. You don't have to wait on them to form, and they can attack that invader immediately, right? So antigens aren't always bad, but they always do produce antibodies. Does that make sense? Don't worry about these. These are parts of your immune system. We do want to think about cytokines. What's really interesting about cytokines is those glucocorticoids will specifically interfere with the messages from your cytokines. The cytokine's job is basically to say, hey, there's an invader over here and you guys need to get over here and take care of this, right? And so they'll call over some of those other parts of the immune system, the white blood cells and so forth. They'll come over and they'll take care of whatever that invader is. If the cytokines can't send that message out, if that gets blocked, then no reinforcements come in, right? You're not getting the rest of that immune response, and so you're going to have a larger effect from that infection. So that's another reason to stay not stressed, right? Stay relaxed. There's actually a correlation, it only works for med students, so it doesn't work for any of you, between final exams and getting illnesses, right? So like despite the fact I know some of you are going to like try to pull that to get out of the final, don't. Because again, I said it only works for med students, right? It's not true for any other kind of student, I promise you. That's not probably true, Sydney. It probably works for anybody, right? If you get stressed, you're more likely to get sick. If you get stressed around finals, you're more likely to get sick around finals. And so there is a legitimate uptick in illness at that time of the year. But you should come in sick anyway and infect the rest of your peers. You have to take that final. What else do I want to think about? We've already talked about, we should talk a little bit about vaccines. If you give someone who is stressed, like let's say their spouse has Alzheimer's and they're a caregiver, they do a lot of studies of stress with Alzheimer's caregivers, right? You can imagine if your spouse has Alzheimer's and you are their primary caregiver, that can be a very stressful situation for you, right? And so that makes a lot of sense. A lot of folks who have Alzheimer's disease are already perhaps part of a study, right? They're already regularly coming into their doctor, so it's easy to sort of monitor their spouse who's bringing them in as well, right? And so getting that person to join a study and stay into a study is a lot easier than trying to find like other folks, right? Because if your spouse has Alzheimer's, you're coming into the doctor on a regular basis, and they may be doing some studies with the person with Alzheimer's. But if you give a vaccine, like a pneumonia vaccine, to somebody with Alzheimer's, their response is lower. They don't make as many antibodies, right? So when you get a vaccine, you want a high enough number of antibodies so that you actually have some sort of immunity to that, right? A few years ago, I had the rabies vaccine. That was a fun one. It was for research purposes. What I mean by that is I was going to be working with a species that had a tendency to carry rabies. And so as a preventative measure, I took the rabies vaccine. It was ferrets. Ferrets are kind of known to carry rabies in some populations. So I had to, and I lived in a state, is rabophobic a word? It is now. I lived in North Carolina, which is a lot of phobic. But in particular, they were afraid of rabies. Oh, jeez, Rosie, it was like constantly I was hearing on the news about some rabid animal. And it was like, watch out for bats, they're rabid. Watch out for foxes, they've got rabies. I'm like, I don't really care. It's like, I like a fox or a bat's not, whatever, right? It's not a big deal. But they were really like serious about rabies in the state of North Carolina. Anybody from North Carolina? They're serious about rabies. You don't think about it, right? You think about what are the other things North Carolina is known for. Rabies is not up there, but they're crazy about rabies. So I had to get a rabies vaccine, and then after you have to get 3 of them, right? And then after 3, I had to do a blood test where they looked for my antibody levels to rabies, and I had to make sure they were high enough to actually grant me some immunity to rabies. If they weren't, then I'd have to get 2 more shots. Thankfully, they were high enough, so I was good to go. So if any of you are rabid and you try to bite me after the final, I'm not going to get rabies. Although, Rebecca, randomly at some point in my life, I may develop rabies because of that vaccine. So you have to, if I start like foaming at the mouth up here, you guys don't know what's going on. Did you know that? They gave me it was like a packet like this thick of like, here are the things that could happen to you if you take this rabies vaccine, but you're going to have to take it anyway because we said so. Whatever. Yeah, it's serious, right? It's a serious, yeah, it's bad news. Did you get a rabies vaccine? Maybe you should think about it. Was it in North Carolina?
Probably.
Yeah. It's frightening, isn't it? How many of you have pet bats? No, nobody has a pet bat, right? We've already talked about stress and infectious diseases. I'm not going to ask you too much about this. This is basically showing you everything that I just talked about, but in graphical form. Let's talk about post-traumatic stress disorder, right? You guys familiar with this? Basically, there are some risk factors and then you have to have some event, right? You have to be exposed to some traumatic event, and then you develop PTSD. What's really interesting is, one, the likelihood you develop PTSD is actually much greater if that violence comes from another person than if it's like from a natural disaster, right? You're more likely to develop PTSD from a physical assault than you are from a hurricane blowing down your house while you're in it, right? Because the hurricane is sort of this impersonal sort of thing, whereas, you know, a physical assault is something very personal and directed toward you. There are also some gender differences in PTSD development. I think in recent years we've typically, if I said, hey, I know a person with PTSD, a lot of people, and this is because of the media, and not because it's not true, but because of the images that are out there, you're immediately thinking of a veteran, right? Which a number of veterans do have PTSD. We're typically thinking of a male veteran because that's typically you know, what jumps to mind for most folks. But in fact, females are more likely to develop PTSD than males, given the same conditions, right? So if males and females are put through the same conditions, the females are going to be more likely to develop PTSD than the males will. In terms of symptoms, you've got your flashbacks, you have intense stress, you have an exaggerated stress response to events that are not going to actually cause you problems. There is this sort of gene-environment interaction. You don't need to worry too much about that. There are some brain changes that occur, right? Your amygdala is actually sort of geared up, right? It's always overactive, your amygdala is. And this is one of the reasons why ACEs are a big predictor of developing post-traumatic stress disorder, right? If you can think about having these, you know, traumatic events as a child, while your amygdala is developing, it's going to have its baseline activity much higher, right? And so your baseline's already going to be elevated. And when you have that event as an adult, that kind of puts you over into the PTSD category, it just makes a lot of sense. You're already up at that elevated state, right? If you don't have those ACEs, you're kind of riding at a lower level, and it's harder to get you up to that overactive state. There's also seems to be a reduced volume of the hippocampus. It's sort of unclear if that's because you got PTSD or you developed PTSD because you had a smaller hippocampus. We don't really know which one comes first. Most people are not getting sort of brain scans. You know, how many of you have had a brain scan? Yeah, like nobody, right? So if some of you develop a mental health issue, a neurological disorder, we have no idea what your brain looked like before, right? So we don't know, was your hippocampus always smaller, or is it only smaller now because you've got these symptoms, right? So there's this is actually in monozygotic twins. So these are identical twins who have PTSD or don't have PTSD, and there's some differences there, which is kind of cool. I think this is a cool graph to think about. Basically what we're doing here is we're showing someone either a happy face or a fearful face, and we're measuring activity in their amygdala or their medial prefrontal cortex. Remember we said that prefrontal cortex was great for telling your amygdala, like, hey, you need to relax, right? This is not something that's going to hurt you. Let's think about the impulse control business, right? And let's stay back. Someone with PTSD, their amygdala, if you look at this compared to a control, you show a control subject a fearful face or a happy face, their amygdala gets excited about the same, right? Just a little bit of an increase in the amygdala, right? You see a face, maybe we should, just in case, right? Maybe the amygdala needs to get ready. But if you look at someone with PTSD, look how much more active for a fearful face and even for a happy face, right? No matter what face they see, look at that elevated amygdala activity compared to the controls. I mean, that's pretty impressive, right? I mean, that's a massive increase in activity. What's sort of interesting is this crisscross relationship in the medial prefrontal cortex. If it's a control subject and they see a happy face, well, their prefrontal cortex gets a little excited about that, but not much, right? Because if it's a happy face, then you don't really have to tell your amygdala to calm down because it's a happy face, right? If it's a fearful face, then there's more activity in the medial prefrontal cortex, right? Because they're saying, oh, this is not something that I really need to get upset about. I'm just, I'm in an artificial study here. I'm just looking at pictures of people's faces. Why should I get excited about that? So their prefrontal cortex gets a little more active. If you look at the person who has PTSD, it's actually flipped, right? Their prefrontal cortex has to get really excited for that happy face, right? Because they need to tell themselves, like, hey, relax. I know the amygdala is already geared up, but we need to bring it back down. But the problem is when they see that fearful face, their prefrontal cortex is not very active. So not only is the amygdala more active, but the prefrontal cortex is less active. So there's an even bigger gap, right, in their response to that fearful face. I think it's sort of a fascinating situation. When it comes to treatments for PTSD, I mean, there are a few treatments, group therapy, give folks antidepressants, cognitive behavior therapy. These are kind of the standard approaches. What you really have to worry about with folks with PTSD is self-medicating, right? And so they will often exhibit alcoholism as well, right? And so they will self-medicate by drinking. Alcohol being a CNS depressant. If your amygdala is always elevated, always geared up, one of the best things to do is drop that down, right? What can I do to reduce activity? Alcohol is a great option, neurologically speaking. In terms of how that affects the rest of your body and your day-to-day functions, it's not a great option, right? Let's see. There's also sort of another interesting, it's not really a treatment so much as it's sort of an intervention, right, for folks with PTSD. And there was an interesting study, it was probably in the last 5 years, with Tetris, right? You guys familiar with Tetris? Yeah, right? You guys don't know Robert Redford, but you know Tetris. So there you go. So Tetris, right, it's a little blocks, you make the lines, things disappear, right? It's a little game. How many of you have access to Tetris right now? Like all of you, right? How many of you have a smartphone? You can download a Tetris app, I'm certain, right? For free, probably. There's probably a free version, okay? So there was a group, they took some people and they said, okay, hey, watch this video. So they showed them like a 12-minute video, and that video included real fatal car accidents, surgical operations, amputations. These are very graphic images, right? So they made these people watch the video, and then what they would do is they said, hey, write down how many times that image kind of jumps in your head, right? So you guys have all gone to see a movie, and like a few days later, you're just like walking around, and all of a sudden a scene from the movie kind of pops in your head, and you can see that, right? That happens. Some of you are going to have an image of a casket, like on a train, pop into your head. It's going to be weird. It's going to be like at the grocery store at Kroger, and you're like all of a sudden like this black casket just come floating by in your brain. I don't know. So you have these recurrent sort of visualizations, right? And that happens. So they ask these folks, hey, write down every time you have one of these recurrent visualizations, right? So they did. They wrote it down sort of in the immediate setting and then also all the way out to 6 weeks later, okay? So that's awesome. So again, you have two groups. One's a control group. They watch the video. They write stuff in their journal. That's it. The second group, they watched the video, and guess what they got to do? They got to play Tetris for 10 minutes. And then they had to write stuff down in their journals. And what they found was that in the sort of the immediate setting and also 6 weeks later, there was a significant reduction in those recurrent visualizations in the Tetris group compared to the control group. And the reason for that, they think, is that Tetris was competing with the visuospatial processes and those resources with that video, right? So you had the video, you were kind of looping around in that visuospatial memory, but you're also playing Tetris, which is interfering, and you're not getting it as deeply encoded. So the idea is maybe, if you're in some kind of stressful situation and you think you're going to get PTSD from that, you should pull out your phone and play Tetris. That's pretty cool, right? I mean, I don't know, I thought it was exciting. How many of you are going to go home and play Tetris now? You should get ready, like after the exam, we should set up a Tetris room across the hall. So you guys take the final and then you just go right over and play 10 minutes of Tetris. And that way you can go home and be nice and, de-stressed. I don't think this works with all video games, so I wouldn't recommend like trying to combat PTSD with Call of Duty 15 or what are they on now? I always joke one day there's going to be Call of Duty 85, Attack of the Rascals. It's going to be all these like old people on Rascals trying to fight each other. Those little like scooters they have. It's like at some point, you gotta, I don't know. They're going to co-release that with the latest Fast and the Furious. Yeah. Vin Diesel's going to be in a wheelchair and he's just going to like leave. I don't know. Anybody a Vin Diesel fan? I don't want to like hurt anybody's feelings. Nobody raised their hand on that, right? You guys are all on Team Rock, right? I mean, nobody's a fan of The Rock. That's disappointing. No. Yeah. Apparently my uncle was a big wrestling fan back when he was younger, and he has a picture with him and like The Rock's grandfather. It's kind of interesting, right? Not The Rock, it was his grandfather. His grandfather was a wrestler as well, a professional wrestler. So this was when he was at, this is not like some random time later, like he went to like some, D-list convention where you get to meet The Rock's grandfather. This was when this guy was, actually doing his thing. All right, we should think about anxiety disorders briefly. You've got this sort of fear of impending disaster. Sometimes you can get panic attacks from that. Shortness of breath, irregularities in your heartbeat. Sometimes you think that's a heart attack, right? If you ever don't, this is a trick, if you ever don't want to wait in line at the ER, tell them you're having chest pains, even if you're there because you broke your leg. Like, oh man, my chest is hurting. Well, they'll take you right in. And you're like, oh no, my chest feels fine. It's really just my leg. I don't know. Dog bit me. You don't think we should do that?
I feel like we should, absolutely.
I feel like you should. I mean, nobody wants to wait in line. I wouldn't recommend that. I mean, if you are having chest pains, obviously, go in and do what you should do. If you guys ever go to the emergency room, you don't have to answer that. Try to stay out of the emergency room, right? That's what I've done with most of my life. Tried to stay out there. You still end up there sometimes, right? Because you always have those days where you think, I can jump over that. It happens. One of the big things you got to worry about is anticipatory anxiety. So this is when you have anxiety about having anxiety, right? So you get anxious because you think you're going to go outside into the world and you're going to have a panic attack. That's going to be bad. So you're going to get anxious about that, and that's going to give you agoraphobia, so you're just going to stay home. I don't think I need to go out today. Could have a panic attack. I don't want to do that in public, right? We already talked about agoraphobia. Generalized anxiety disorder. It's almost exactly what it says it is, right? It's like one of the few times we've named something and it makes perfect sense. Generalized anxiety disorder. That's it. You've got anxiety about stuff. Social anxiety. You're afraid of like the scrutiny of others, right? You don't want to get into social situations, which unfortunately we're a social species. Can really create some problems for you, right? If you have to go out and do that. Does seem to be heritable. There seem to be some variance in what we call the brain-derived neurotrophic factor. Problem is BD and F is like sort of used for everything, right? You need it for like normal brain function. So obviously if that gene's sort of screwed up, you're going to have some problems somewhere. Obviously the amygdala is involved here. Don't worry about that too much. One of the best ways to treat anxiety disorder is to give folks like a GABA agonist, right? GABA is that inhibitory neurotransmitter. We're going to open chloride channels, like benzodiazepines, for example, right? They'll often give folks benzodiazepines to deal with anxiety. That's really great for about 10 minutes. I always say if you're on a benzodiazepine longer than 10 minutes, you're taking it too long, right? Benzodiazepines are very short-term things that you should take if you're having sort of like a crisis moment and we need to get you calm and sedate you a little bit. You should not be on a benzodiazepine for an extended period of time at all, right? And so if you are, I would recommend talking to your mental health professional about that. If they say don't worry about it, I'd recommend getting another mental health professional. It's just I'm not a mental health professional, but I know a thing about brains, and you shouldn't be on benzodiazepines for a long time. Right, Jacob? You know this.
There is a bit of move recently to start taking people off. Of course, that's problematic because
it's
been on this for decades.
Yeah.
There's a list of other issues. A company trying to get someone off.
Right. Yeah. Obviously, a sort of a withdrawal symptom of quitting your benzodiazepine is going to be anxiety, right? Because you were taking it to treat the anxiety in the first place, and maybe that anxiety is whatever was causing that is dissipated, right? That you may have moved past that, but if you've been on that drug for a long period of time, you're still going to have some problems coming off of it. So here's another one. I mean, you can definitely use alcohol to treat your anxiety. That will definitely fix your anxiety. That will create you some other problems, so don't self-medicate. That's the point of that, right? Works on the same receptor, and it's going to have similar effects, at least at that receptor level, but obviously the other things that come with that are going to be problematic, okay? This is why, again, we have to really worry about folks with a substance use disorder and anxiety, depression, whatever it is. Although you're not probably going to, I don't know, some people might treat their depression with a CNS depressant, but I wouldn't recommend that either. So you see that a lot because it is unfortunately, and this is a thing, right? Jacob, in the state of West Virginia, what do you think is easier to get your hands on? Alcohol or a trained mental health professional? Yeah, alcohol, right? And heroin. That's the other one. Well, you can. That's true as well.
You get a hold of whatever you want a lot easier and a lot cheaper than one
Yeah, which is unfortunate. It is sad because I think a lot of folks, and then it's not just even the, so it's not even just like the material cost, right? But there's some social cost to going to, and if you guys had seen The Sopranos, right? Wouldn't this be a perfect segue into like stigma and mental health? Ah, man. So you learn this pretty early, but Tony Soprano, played by James Gandolfini, I don't know, probably like half the show is him in, well, a third of the show is probably him in the office of his mental health professional. Now, obviously, there are some things that I would not model, if you're going to be a mental health professional, I would not model my behavior necessarily on his doctor's approach, because there are some times where there are some things that cross the line and so forth. But there's a lot of stigma attached to that too, right? So I think that becomes a problem, even if you have good insurance and you have access to a mental health professional. A lot of folks won't go because they view that differently than high cholesterol. But it's the same stuff, right? I mean, nobody's like, oh man, you're a loser, you got high cholesterol, right? That's a pretty normal thing. But some people are like, I don't want to talk to that guy. I mean, he's got depression. Nobody wants to be around him. But it's really just the same stuff, right? I mean, it's all just a biological problem, and we just have to, figure out what to do to fix it. It's a completely different approach. That's my take on it. Whatever. So if you're going to treat anxiety disorders, I mean, really right now you're going to be thinking like SSRIs, right? Selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors. I mean, if you're going to treat it pharmacologically. In addition to that, you should seek out, some sort of, therapeutic intervention as well, right? So that you can get things straightened out. While taking drugs to solve these problems might, on a biological level, fix things, you might not be taking the steps necessary to fix your sort of, like social arrangements, right? That could actually make a difference in your life and prevent these things from happening. So it's always great to, use more than one approach, right, to solve a problem. This is basically just showing you, and there's an SSRI it was better than a placebo at helping folks with their panic disorder. It's not a big surprise. What about OCD? What do you want to think about OCD? I do want to say, like, often people will say this, right? And I think, I don't know, it bothers me a little bit. Like, I'm OCD. I gotta, like, go clean my house. It's like, no, that's just being hygienic, right? So clean your house. That's fine. Doesn't mean you have a mental health disorder. When you have OCD, obsessive-compulsive disorder, you have these obsessions, right? I'm going to get germs and die. Someone's going to break into my house. My house is going to burn down, right? And these are all things we think about, right? I mean, all of us think about that. We all take steps that are necessary to prevent that. The problem becomes when you have these compulsions, right? And so you might get germs and get sick, so what do? You wash your hands. You don't wash your hands until they bleed, right? That's somebody who has OCD will wash their hands until their hands are raw, right? And their skin's falling off. How many of you lock your doors at your house? Those of you that don't, if you'll write down your address, we'll come in and take some of those unwanted valuables off your hands. That's fine. And what do? You lock your door and you check it. Make sure it's locked. That's normal. Checking it 30 times is not. Checking it and getting it in your car and then getting back out and checking again and then getting back in your car and going back again, Rebecca, and checking and then getting back in your car and then I got to check one more time because maybe it just became unlocked while I didn't have my eyes on the door. Then you go back. That's a compulsion, right? It's this ritualized sort of repetitive behavior, and that's when it becomes a problem. Okay, that's much different than I think I'm going to trim my fingernails today because I like to be clean, just to kind of clear that up. You hear that a lot, right? People are like, oh, I'm OCD, let me stack my magazines. Well, just stack your magazines.
Yeah, just organization's the big one.
Yeah.
That I'm like, no one's supposed to do today.
Yeah, no, that's normal. You should know what you're doing today, right, Rosie? You got those 2 planners. You're good to go. Do you have 2 planners? No. It's okay. You should think about it. There is some relationship between OCD and Tourette's, which is kind of interesting. And Tourette's, another one I just want to clear up. If you're just like randomly yelling swear words, that's really not typically Tourette's, right? Tourette's is mostly like, we're thinking about like facial tics, right, and other body tics. That's the primary sort of symptom. Very rarely do you see people having these vocalizations, right? But you do sometimes. So why Tourette's? All of these are sort of related. We'll talk about autism in a minute. Tourette's, OCD, they all have some involvement in the basal ganglia. You guys talked about that with Parkinson's and Huntington's disease as well, right? Because it's related to these movements, okay? An obsessive-compulsive disorder, if you think about the movements, right, you're constantly doing some behavior, right? It's this repetitive behavior. So a friend of mine, his mom had OCD, and she would like constantly go through and like click the knobs on her stove because it was a gas stove, and she wanted to make sure the stove was off so her house didn't blow up. And she would check it like 10 times. Every time she walked by the stove, just coming through and like checking all the knobs to make sure they're turned off, right? That's a compulsion, right? This is causing problems. Don't worry too much about that. Those other slides. We should talk about autism spectrum disorder. This is a tough one, right? So the problem is, how many of you know, I mean, you don't have to answer this, but how many of you know someone that's been diagnosed with autism spectrum disorder, right? I mean, a lot of folks do, right? And the problem is you might know 2 or 3 people who are diagnosed with autism spectrum disorder. And Sydney, they may have 2 completely different sets of behavior, right? And so I think about where I used to live, my neighbor, his name was Jim. Jim had autism. And Jim, Jim was probably 30, lived with his parents, right? He wasn't able to hold down a job. Part of that's because he went into one job drunk, but that's a whole separate story, right? That'll lose you a job fast. But Jim was, I mean, he would walk the neighborhood, he would talk to you. Now, every time he talked to you, he rocked back and forth the whole time. You know, so that's that stereotyped behavior. A lot of times when you see someone who's been diagnosed with autism spectrum disorder, they do have that kind of rocking or stereotyped behavior. They'll have some behavior they continue to repeat. But Jim would come through and dig through your trash too, and he would take out your electronics. Like if you threw away a CD player, Jim would be like, "Hey, can I have your CD player?" I was like, "Sure, Jim, whatever." And then he would take that CD player. He would make solar-powered Christmas lights, or his whole garage was like lined with computer and electronics equipment. So he would just like constantly do those things. This was a crazy one. He managed to get from somebody at a gas station one of those hot dog cookers. You know that like at the gas station they cook the hot dogs. He took it. This is crazy. He took it apart and like used those prongs somehow to stuck them in the dirt and would shoot an electrical current across that, and worms would come up, and then he would collect the worms and sell them to a bait shop. It was
Genius.
He was genius. Jim was a genius. I mean, he was constantly, and then, but Jim was also someone who knew, right? Like sometimes you see people and they know they have autism, right? And so Jim's like, when I met him, he's like, "You're just gonna have to tell me when I'm annoying and that I need to go home." And I was like, "Okay, Jim, I'll tell you." And sometimes I had to, and I was like, "Hey, Jim, I got to go inside because it's like midnight, and you've been telling me about worms and hot dog cookers for 4 hours now. I got things I got to do." And he's like, "Oh, okay, I'm sorry. You just got to tell me." It's like, "All right, Jim, just have at it." So, forgot to close my garage one time, and then Jim, amazing trick, he went in my garage, hit the down button, and ran out and jumped over the sensor. I would have loved to have seen this, and then he told me about it when I got home. He's like, "Hey, you forgot to close your garage today." He's like, "So I went in, I hit the button, and I jumped." I was like, "Thanks, Jim." Huh? I've never done that. I mean, if it's my own garage, I just hit the button in my car.
As kids, we would like hit the buttons, like jump over them to see if they're fast enough all the time. Like we would just play with the garage.
Oh, we didn't have a garage when I was. Yeah, we didn't have a garage. Yeah, too old, right? We kept our horses in the stable, closed those doors. So anyway, but that's completely different than someone who has autism spectrum disorder and they're nonverbal, right? Some of you may know someone who's nonverbal who has autism, right? And so it's really kind of hard. You look at both of those guys and you're like, well, Jim was just annoying and he liked electronics, and this guy can't even talk to me. How do they have the same disorder, right? You know, I mean, so it really becomes kind of a difficult thing to conceptualize. I think give us a few years and we'll realize that they're probably different things. I think right now we're kind of lumping a lot of folks into this because we don't understand all of the brain mechanisms. And eventually we're going to say, hey, something different's going on over here than it is here, and then we can get a better diagnosis and do things better. But the main hallmark that you want to look for is difficulty with social relations, right? Even the most social and high functioning folks with autism spectrum disorder have some sort of difficulty with social interactions, right? I don't. It's the same now, right?
They used to differentiate. That's like the same. They now lump everything.
It's all.
There could still be people, like if you work somewhere that you're looking at medical records, and like that still might show up just from sort of carrying over. But yeah, the new DSM is just all autism spectrum.
Yeah, which is, I don't know. Sometimes it's helpful, sometimes it's not, right? I guess.
I'm thinking the reason they lumped it in is just to get people more services so that they weren't sort of excluded.
Right.
But yeah, that's sort of resulting in this issue that such different presentations. It can be very misleading. Like you just see somebody with diagnosis and haven't seen them, you don't really know what's going on.
Yeah. And I've even seen students here that are like with the Autism Services Center, and I think, you know, I'm not a clinician. Like, that kid doesn't have autism. I think you don't have autism when you get my jokes and then you make similar jokes back to me. That, you know, right? Like if you're making jokes, I don't think that counts, right? I mean, that's, so like, I don't know, whatever. But again, I think it's about services. And I think, Jacob, that actually brings up an interesting sort of thing we'll talk about in the next chapter is sometimes the service side of psychology and brain sciences has a little bit of a conflict with the mechanistic side, right? And so I think in this case, what's practical to get someone assistance might not map on as well to what's actually going on. And we're going to talk about that in some more detail when we talk about drug addiction, and we talk about like the medical model and maybe, you know, some other approaches. All right, let's see. Other things to think about with autism: you have a really rapid growth of your brain for the first couple years, and then things slow down a little bit. Fusiform face area doesn't work well, which makes a lot of sense for somebody who's having difficulty with social interaction. So much of our social interactions are facially based, right? And if somebody is not great at understanding what's going on with someone's face, they're not going to read that situation properly. There's also some idea that folks with autism have sort of a malfunctioning mirror neuron system. It was an interesting idea, and it kind of makes some sense theoretically. There's not always been the evidence to back that up. And then this is not Borat. This is the other brother. It's actually his brother. His brother's a neuroscientist. It's kind of cool, right? I mean, this is career paths, right? And he had some idea about the extreme male brain. Males are slightly more likely to be diagnosed with autism spectrum disorder than females. Is that still true? Because I know for a while it seemed to be the case. All right, what about ADHD? We can move on to that. Basically, with ADHD, your prefrontal cortex isn't working, so it's not telling you, hey, you shouldn't do that. So guess what you do? Whatever that is, right? You just keep doing it. How do we treat this? We typically give folks, used to give folks stimulants. Doesn't make a lot of sense, right? Why would you give somebody who's already hyperactive a stimulant? The idea is hopefully it wakes up that frontal cortex, gets that guy working, and can add some impulse control, right? Now there's some other approaches now that are non-stimulant based that are also pretty effective. Any questions about that before we move on to drug abuse? All right. We are moving right along here. I'll probably get you guys out of here by 8 o'clock tonight. See how that works. You guys didn't have anything else planned, right? Quizzes. I think you were going to go home and do those. So I don't want to keep you from that. Right? And you're going to watch The Natural. I wish they had seen that because it was just... And The Sopranos, right? I mean, this was perfect. Drug abuse. How many of you have heard of that? Great show of hands there. So here's one. Most people who are exposed to drugs do not become addicted to them. That's actually true, right? How many of you are drug users? I don't know if I want to answer. Everybody's a drug user, right? There's one small group of folks who might not be. I don't know if any of you are Mormons. You don't have to answer that. That's a personal question. Mormons don't ingest caffeine. Yeah, there you go, right? So no caffeine. That's kind of interesting, right? I don't know. I don't think I have anything else to say about Mormons at this point.
It's on the Book of Mormon play. Watch that.
Really?
Yeah.
Yeah, Dawn said she was just in Chicago and watched it, and it was good.
Cincinnati.
Yeah. I just stayed at a hotel that had a Book of Mormon.
Oh.
Yeah, next to the Bible. I just like pulled open the drawers like, what's that?
Likely correct, I guess.
I don't know. I didn't read it. I had other things to do. No comment. But I think most of you have ingested caffeine. Is that true? Yeah, right. I think I can. And a number of you have ingested nicotine and alcohol, right? Okay, so you don't have to answer that because I know some of you aren't of the age to do at least one of those. I think you're all of the age to do one, but not the other necessarily. Some of you might be under 21. You don't have to answer that if that's true. So I think most folks have taken some psychoactive drug, caffeine being in that category, right? So, I don't have to say like, you're a drug user. I don't mean cocaine. Any substance that you take that's an external substance that has some effect on your nervous system, that's a psychoactive drug, right? So anything that you take, so there you go, right? A lot of things fall in that category. It's a very broad sort of definition. You think about if any of you are on an SSRI, that's perfectly normal. There you go. That's a psychoactive drug. Right? We've talked about those. So this is that medical model approach that we were talking about earlier. Much better than the previous approach, which was like the willpower approach, right? So like if you're a drug addict, you're a horrible person. That's why you're a drug addict. Sorry. You guys just need to get over that and be a better person and you'll stop using drugs. That's not a real effective approach, right? So now we have this medical model. I think for practical purposes, it's pretty good, right? Get you access to insurance. Insurance will pay for some of the rehabilitation. For some folks, thinking about it as a disease is helpful. I think for some folks it's not, and that's really where my problem with it is. I think the medical model is not terribly sound scientifically. I think it also, if you were to ask someone who is a drug addict, they would probably tell you, a lot of them will tell you, I actually don't feel sick, right? I'm not sick. I don't have a diseased brain. I'm just, addicted to a substance or a behavior, right? And I think that brings up another point we'll talk about in a moment. But I think for me, if you're addicted to something, your brain's doing exactly what it should do. Your brain is evolved to find an activity that will increase your dopamine level with the least amount of effort. Okay? That's exactly what your brain does. Right? For many of you, there are many activities that will raise your dopamine levels. Getting a good grade on the exam, that'll do it. Finding $5 in your winter coat pocket, that'll do it, right? Exercise, right? That does it for a lot of folks. Exercise is a great one, actually. Lots of things, right? People find it from spending time with friends and family, taking care of your kids. What are some other, activities? Anybody, play golf or tennis or Jenga? I don't know. Whatever it is, whatever it is that works for you, those things will give you a little shot of dopamine, right? Now, they don't give you a massive shot. They give you a little shot, and that's fine. The problem happens when you are kind of bouncing around, you're like trying different activities, and all of a sudden you try one that gives you a massive spike of dopamine, right? You're like, wow, that was awesome, and I didn't do a lot of work for it. So I'm going to try that again. Okay? And for me, I know in the DSM, it's actually substance use disorder, alcohol use disorder, and then there's behavior disorder, only gambling, right? A behavioral addiction, that's what I mean. For me, I think it's all addiction, it's all the same. It's a behavior, doesn't matter what it is. If you're doing something, it's increasing dopamine levels. If it's shooting up heroin, or if it's out there playing disc golf, whatever it is, that's jacking up your dopamine levels, then that's what's going on. Doesn't matter if it's a behavior or not. But when you luck upon something that gives you a massive boost of dopamine, you're going to repeat that. Now, for some of you, that might be getting one of those like blue ribbons at the end on the finish line, right? Those are pretty awesome. So that'll give you a big bit of dopamine. For some people, it's cocaine. And it's really the exact same neurological process, right? Your ventral tegmental area is dumping a bunch of dopamine onto the nucleus accumbens. End of story. That's really it. That's all that's going on at the very basic level. That's it. And whatever it is you're doing to make that happen is going to be something you want to repeat, right? And if that's something that is positive, or that we deem positive, then that's going to be fine. You're going to be good to go, right? No worries. If it's something that has some negative detrimental health effects, prevents you from doing the other things that you should do in your life, then that's going to be a bad thing, right? And that's really all it comes down to. Now, from a treatment perspective, they use this biopsychosocial approach. They think about the biological aspects, but also the psychological and the social aspects. A lot of that's going to be focused on why are you using drugs? Why did you resort to drugs? I think that's a big issue, right? Like, why do people use drugs? Once they're on drugs, we know what's happening. But getting them off the drugs, that's a different story too, right? Because, again, your brain has evolved to continue to do that behavior that is just jacking up those dopamine levels. So it's really hard to break free of that. And we'll talk about some other things in a moment. Here are a number of drugs that are commonly abused. I think there is at least one here that we could probably not include on that list, right? For me, it's a little hard to think about putting marijuana on the abused drugs list for a couple reasons. One,
It's just funny, isn't it? I agree, but
yeah, it doesn't work the same way as these other drugs, right? Most of the other drugs on this list work by really jacking up your dopamine levels. Marijuana doesn't really do that, right? That's why it's not, in the traditional sense, it's not addictive, right? Doesn't mean it's not a habit, right? Habits are fine, right? I mean, how many of you have a habit of, waking up on Sunday and watching, not The Natural, watching something else, and you eat a, I don't know, what do you eat, with a bagel, I don't know what you do, right? It's a Sunday, right? We do whatever you want. And that's your habit, right? That's not addictive. You just get up, you eat a bagel, and you watch some TV, right? And that's not a big deal. You could not do that, and you'd be just fine. No problems. And I think marijuana is probably in that category. It doesn't work the same way. Other drugs that don't work the same way, you notice a drug that's not in here is LSD, right? LSD is not a dopaminergic agonist at all, right? It really works on that serotonergic system. One of the reasons why they're thinking about microdosing LSD for depression, right? Because it works like an SSRI and increases serotonin levels. So I'm not recommending that you use LSD to treat your depression. I want to be clear about that. But if you are, I'd be happy to hear about it.
do a case study.
Yeah, we'll do a case. We'll write that up. I'll leave most of your name out of it. So, like LSD, psilocybin, a lot of the drugs that you see that are used in sort of religious ceremonies in other cultures, they're not addictive, right? You don't have to worry about overdoses. They don't create problems. Most people who use LSD, they just stop because they got bored with it. Like, well, I did that for a while. It was fun. And then I quit, Kind of like people who play Call of Duty 3. They quit because they got bored, right? It's like, I'll try something else. It's not a big deal. And marijuana kind of falls in the same category. So there you go. And I think what we're finding, what's really kind of interesting, is that a number of these drugs actually have, some benefits if administered correctly, right? Like almost any of these drugs could solve a problem you have, if it was administered correctly and you didn't, if it didn't get out of hand. Some of them are easier to keep under control than others. Methamphetamine being one that's pretty difficult to keep under control. So I wouldn't use methamphetamine as like a, nobody's going to have like a medical use of methamphetamine, right? But amphetamines were...
I think it can still be prescribed technically.
Amphetamine? Oh, methamphetamine?
Yeah, I mean, obviously I don't think it ever is.
No, I don't think it is either. But you could, right? I mean, it could solve some problem for you. A little lethargic, a little methamphetamine will put you on the right path. Not a big deal. Positive reinforcement, we know about that. Drugs have this reinforcing effect because the increase of dopamine that is dumped onto the nucleus accumbens. It's that simple. Ventral tegmental area to nucleus accumbens. Dopamine. That's it. That's all you need to know about drug addiction, behavioral addiction, any addictive behavior, anything that you do that makes you feel good. That's what's happening right there. That's it. It's that simple. Most of your behavior is motivated by activity in the VTA and nucleus accumbens. I know that's really, like on some level that's a little depressing, right? You think like, oh, I thought I was doing something because of, this was a positive good for the world. No, just gave you a little dopamine in the nucleus accumbens. Make you feel just as good. Don't worry too much about the striatum. I'm not going to really ask you about that. Let's see, cocaine users. I did want to talk to you about, not this stuff. Relapse, right? So this is the other thing. And you don't have to answer this. How many of you know someone who has tried to stop either a behavioral or substance addiction, right? A lot of folks have. I mean, how many of you have tried, almost everyone knows someone who's tried to stop smoking, right? I mean, Cindy, you were telling us about ACEs and smoking cessation earlier. It's a pretty common thing, right? Other drugs, similar situations. And this actually brings us back to that learning and memory, that fear conditioning sort of situation. If you remembered, we had that extinction process, right? So in this case, we've got a rat who's taking the drug, and all of a sudden they press the lever, they don't get the drug anymore, right? And so eventually they're going to stop, okay? So eventually they know lever press does not give me drug, so I just stop, right? And you can do that, right? So this is, think about someone going through a rehabilitation treatment facility, right? Okay. And then they get released and they go out into the world, and they're out, and they always tell you what's one of the number one things they tell you to do. If you're dealing with addiction and you've gone through rehab for that, you have to really live and operate somewhere else, right? You don't want to go back into the same environment where you were using those drugs, because those cues are there, right? They're going to again trigger that ventral tegmental to nucleus accumbens, because what happens over time is it's not just the heroin, well then it's the needle, and then it's the tourniquet, and then it's the special ringtone you had for your drug dealer, right? And seriously, so you start to, like, all of those things become very reinforcing for you, so you really need to get out of that situation. So you see this a number of times. Folks will get out. Of course they're going to relapse. They have not forgotten that relationship. The rat didn't forget lever press cocaine, right? You didn't forget drug, a lot of dopamine, right? That's still there, because that relationship might become important again, so you don't forget it. You just kind of suppressed it a little bit, right? What you see a lot of folks do, unfortunately, is once they've been clean for an extended period of time, all of those tolerance mechanisms have washed out, right? You no longer have the tolerance, and they end up back in a situation where they have that drug craving, and they succumb to that drug craving. Perfectly natural, normal process. In fact, you should anticipate that this is going to happen, right? So you can prepare for that, and I think that's great for you. And if you're dealing with addiction, or if someone in your sort of immediate circle is, I would be ready for them to relapse, because it's going to happen, right? And don't look at them as like, oh, you're horrible, you relapsed, why'd you do this? It's a biological function. It's going to happen. And so you should prepare for that. Don't think worse about yourself or the other person because of it, right? Because it's the situation. You should just be prepared for that. But what happens, unfortunately, back here, while you're constantly using the drug, you're taking a much higher dose than when you started, right? Because your tolerance is built up. all that tolerance has gone away. Often folks will go right back up to that same dose they were using the last time, and that's why you see a lot of overdoses in folks who have been clean for an extended period of time. Rather than starting back at a low-end dose, they start back at that higher dose. And I think, I mean, for me, I'm thinking like, well, I know if you're addicted to drugs, you're going to be clean for a while, you're going to go back and do drugs again, right? So for me, it's important to educate you about starting at a lower dose, right? Like, I know you're going to relapse, okay? So let's prepare for that. Let's know if I do relapse, I need to take a smaller dose, right? And I really need to keep telling myself that, because I think you need to, you know, so that way you can survive that relapse and give it a go again, because it just takes a while. Most folks who use heroin, they stop using after about 15 years. Rosie, the problem is getting them to live 15 years, right? So if you're a heroin addict, your life expectancy is not that high, right? Because you're going to do things that are going to be risky. There are a lot of secondary sort of problems you have to worry about, infections from dirty needles and so forth, right? But if you can take the steps necessary to help those individuals so they can kind of make it out to that 15-year mark, then they seem to be clean for an extended period of time, which is kind of an interesting sort of approach, right? But I think it is important to prepare for those relapses, right? If you're in a situation where you're dealing with that, you know, it's not. I'm not telling you like, oh, you're awful, you're going to fail, but let's be realistic, right? Don't set unrealistic expectations, and then you're definitely setting yourself up for failure, right? You should always be prepared for that worst case scenario, and you know, just be ready for that. That's my take on it. You guys can, you know, think whatever you want about it, I guess. People aren't telling people that, right? I don't think they tell people when you get out of rehab, like, hey, you guys are going to relapse, cut your dose, you know, when you do that so you don't die. That doesn't really seem like a positive way to send somebody out in the world, right? But it's a realistic way. So. Yeah, yeah. It reminds me, my wife used to work, we lived in Louisville, and she worked for the Louisville Metro government for a while, and she worked on this program that was like a, I don't know, she went to these sort of at-risk schools, is that the word they use? And she would take middle school girls, and she would like give them like, you know, hygiene talks, or like, here's how, you know, just like these things. She had like the president of a bank come in. A lot of the kids, their parents didn't go to the bank, they just went like to the gas station to cash their checks, so they didn't understand like how a bank works, and so these other things, which is really, you know, something that you don't always think about. And because it was a federally funded program, she could only talk to them about abstinence-based sex ed, which was like right. Yeah, some of you may be here because it didn't work, which is, you know, just tossing that out there. Just go home and ask your mom. So she said, well, she told her boss, she said, look, I'm going to tell them what they need to know. Just, if you're going to fire me for it, just so you know. But the problem was she had, like, there was this middle school girl, like, in one of her groups who was pregnant, and she was like, obviously the approach you guys are using doesn't work. So, yeah, often they're not always open to radical approaches, right? Preventative, right? Yeah, yeah. So there you go. Heritability, don't worry about that. Should we think about alcohol metabolism, opiates? Really, it's all the same. It's that nucleus accumbens and that ventral tegmental area. I guess this is important. There's not a drug that you're going to take that's going to have an effect on your body if you don't make a substance similar to that already in your body, right? Why do opioids work? You have endogenous opioids. You make opioids inside your body that work on your opioid receptors, right? They're not quite as good as morphine, right? That's why morphine has a much powerful sort of effect. If you stub your toe, you're going to release some opioids, right, inside your body. Again, your toe's still going to hurt. If you stub your toe and then shoot in some morphine, everything's going to be fine, right? You're not going to feel that pain. It's because these exogenous drugs are typically more powerful, right? And some of them have been intentionally designed to be more powerful. So there was some person in a lab somewhere, and they said, hey, there's this substance that people take, and it gives them some pain relief. What if I take this atom and bend it over here, and that atom and bend it over here? let's see what happens. And then you have things that are much more powerful than the other substances. So this is why I always tell people, again, if you're going to do a drug, do the natural version, right? And this is the only one you really have to think about is marijuana right now, right? Because all the rest are sort of illegal everywhere. So I know like synthetic marijuana is like a big thing, right? And so you guys are like, I'm going to go out and buy my K2 or whatever, right? Please don't. Just grow it and roll it yourself. It's much safer. And the reason I say that is these synthetic. The interesting thing about synthetic marijuana is it doesn't include, and it's not even really synthetic marijuana. It's synthetic THC, right? Because marijuana contains THC and cannabidiol, right? CBD. You guys have probably seen that somewhere. And the CBD actually is protective against psychotic episodes, right? And occasionally you'll get somebody who has a psychotic episode if they use marijuana. It's much more likely to happen if you're using those synthetic THCs because there's not that cannabidiol there to prevent you from having that. So natural is always the way to go, right? We could talk about these things. You guys know. I think I am required to say don't do drugs unless you know what you're doing. I told my class, my psychopharm class a few weeks ago, I wasn't even thinking about this. I said, yeah, back when I used to buy drugs. And then I realized, like, oh, I forgot to tell you guys. I worked in a lab where we gave rats, we gave them LSD, we gave them methamphetamine, ecstasy, cocaine. Yeah, I know, we gave them all kinds of stuff.
All the same rats or different?
Different rats, typically. Yeah, different rats. Not all at the same time. The only one that was sort of frightening was when we gave the this is kind of counterintuitive, but we gave these juvenile rats ecstasy, like one dose, right? Like a reasonable dose, right? Like if you're going to take ecstasy. And then we measured their social activity as adults, and they were actually, and this is, again, counterintuitive, they were actually less socially engaged than control rats. And there was some actual, again, this was during development, right? And so some of their brain development was a little screwed up. So I don't know if anybody found that interesting. Most of the other drugs, the rats would just kind of swim in pools of their own urine. So we would kind of put them in these boxes and monitor them, and then they just would urinate, and then they would just kind of like swim around, and that was kind of the extent of it. The cocaine was a little different, because the cocaine, they would just kind of, they would run around a lot. But the LSD, I mean, they were just like, I don't know what they thought they were swimming in, but it was definitely their own urine. And then you had to get them out of the box covered in their own urine, and you're like, oh, this is nasty. So I had to go in like twice a day, like every 12 hours, and give these drugs to these rats. Yeah, it was something. Alcohol. I could tell you guys, like, you know, don't anything is bad in the wrong dose, right? I remember when I was in graduate school, there was this guy who taught like toxicology and pharmacology courses, and he was like, I'll let you put any substance into my body if I get to choose the concentration and the route of administration. I'm like, oh, yeah, I mean, he's like, I'll put anything, you know, because your body has some mechanism to take care of just about everything, right? But, you know, even like Tylenol is bad for you if you do too much, right? Your liver will kick out. All right, there's cannabis, THC, opioids, treatments. I'm not going to ask you a whole lot about this stuff. I mean, I would look over this if I were you guys, but that's about it. All right, so I did want to wrap up just a little early in case anybody had some questions.